Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and welcome to the ancient Greek world. I am very glad indeed you decided to choose this course, and I hope you enjoy it. It certainly will be my aim to make you enjoy it. My name is Matthew Kyle, and I am a adjunct professor in classics here at Fordham, where I teach classes on Roman history, Greek history, the classical tradition throughout Western education. And one of my courses that I do every year is several times a year actually is called Pagans and Christians, the kind of history of the church up until about the 6th century, 600s or so. Now, and that is my kind of academic position. As my day job is that I'm a Latin teacher in a high school in New York City, in Queens, which I've been doing now for 20 years, actually, solid 20 years, since 2001. In the first part of this opening section of our lecture tonight, I'm going to talk about why ancient Greece is so important for us. I'll also address what this course is about and how I've organized the lectures in it. Afterwards, we're going to look at aspects of what modern historians call the Bronze Age. That is the period from about 3000 BC to roughly 1150 BC. And I want to look at these aspects because they have a direct bearing on what we're going to be studying in detail. But to begin with, why the Greeks? This is probably a question that you'll be asked by people that you know. If you tell them that this semester you're studying ancient Greek history, you might hear, well, why? Well, certainly we hear all the time that the roots of our Western tradition lie with the ancient Greeks, and this is, of course, true. We think about what they created, what they pioneered, what they formalized in the spheres of politics, tragedy, comedy, poetry, pottery, sculpture, medicine, science, rhetoric. The list simply goes on and on. In fact, almost every one of those words that I've just said is actually of Greek origin because they were the inventors of so many of those things. Certainly, their literary and philosophical legacies, for example, shaped for centuries the cultures of many civilizations, and they continue to do so. Where would we be, for instance, without Homer, Plato, Aristotle, or Greek tragedy? Certainly, such great Western writers as Molière could not have written some of his comedies without Roman comedy, which in turn owed its origins to Greek New Comedy. President Bill Clinton could not have given his 50th anniversary of D-Day speech as he did in 1994 at the United States National Cemetery above Omaha Beach without the sentiments expressed by Pericles, that is, the Athenian great statesman, in his funeral oration of 430 BC. We will be looking at both of those speeches, both the Clinton speech and the Pericles speech. But if we go even further, nor could Abraham Lincoln have actually given his Gettysburg Address as he did without reference to Pericles as well, or really without reference to Pericles' funeral oration. And although rhetoric has changed from what was really a performance art in classical Athens to something that is interpreted and thought about today, the classical works are still exploited and looked to for inspiration. And so indeed are the classical orators. I remember hearing very much when Obama was president a few years ago, although it seems like quite a long time ago, references to the Athenian orator of the 4th century, Demosthenes, who was a statesman and orator, and referring to how Barack Obama's rhetoric in his speeches was stirring in kind of a similar sort of way as Demosthenes' was. Well, these are all very good reasons for studying the ancient Greeks so that we can learn more about the origins and development of our own culture and our civilization. But what I want to do, or I want to suggest, is something different. I want to focus on 3 aspects of Greek history that are as much a mainstay of our tradition and our world as they were of the Greeks. And those 3 things are democracy, law, and imperialism. In other words, what we're used to in our society today, these 3 things, how we live, what we have come to expect, and why. And I believe that these 3 topics are ultimately that is, these 3 topics of democracy, law, and imperialism, these 3 things help to answer the question of why we need to study the Greeks. And moreover, And this is something that is my own personal perspective. And you're going to be hearing a lot of my own personal perspectives as the time goes on in our class. But I believe that these three categories, democracy, law, and imperialism, inform us more about the Greeks than other aspects of their society, such as the artistic and the cultural. These three aspects will show us what we owe the Greeks, what things they actually did that for us play a hands-on role in our society today. And that is why we're going to discuss these three topics in such detail, a lot of detail. And I mean a lot, probably more than you've come across before. But that is how I like to do things. And we're going to be discussing these things critically, which is another way I like to do things. And when I say critically, what I mean is, for instance, we're told that the Athenians invented democracy, but we shouldn't just immediately accept that and move on. We should say, we should ask, how was it invented? Who invented it? Was it one person or a group of individuals? How long did it take to develop into a mature system of government? Democracy was born out of civil war, as we will find out, between nobles and non-nobles in Athens over such issues as social and economic distress and the lack of political rights for all but the aristocrats. Despite despite all of these things, or barely because of all these things, the non-nobles were desperate to end the civil war, as were the nobles too. And so therefore the ruling families of Athens, that is those aristocrats who were in charge of things, they gave absolute power to a man named Solon in the year 594. And he was given the express mandate to fix the problem, to end the civil war. And he introduced legislation that for the first time opened up political office to non-nobles. And he arranged for non-nobles to take part in political debate and to make policy. And in doing so, he created democracy. Needless to say, many changes and additions were made to what Solon enacted over the years. And in 462 BC, an Athenian named Ephialtes introduced radical, or what we call direct democracy, into Athens, where the people were sovereign in the state, and every adult male citizen could actually take, and not just could, but it had to take direct part in running the government, speaking before the assembly, voting on things, passing laws, and so on, sitting on juries. And that sort of direct involvement in the state, this is what we call direct or radical democracy. And this remained the norm, apart from a couple of hiccups along the way, really down until the Macedonians abolished Athenian democracy in the year 322, almost at the end of the 4th century BC. Solon then was the father of democracy, and he's often called that. But given his obvious importance to the Greeks and to us, why is he not a household name the way, say, other Greeks are, like Socrates, or even later European thinkers like Martin Luther, who also pioneered some new things that affected their times and beyond? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but Solon was obviously important to the Greeks because in later Greek tradition, he was numbered among the so-called 7 sages of Greece. And we will be learning all about him in our lecture number 3. Well, in tandem with the creation of democracy was that of law, or at least the beginnings of a formal legal code. Again, what were the origins of the legal code? How did it develop? Was there such a thing as a father of Greek law, the way there was of Greek democracy? And the answer to that is yes, there was. The origins of law, although like democracy, lie in civil strife. And in the 620s BC, about 30 years or so before Solon, who I've just been talking about, the tension we just mentioned had not yet escalated into civil war. But the economic, social, and political tensions were running high, and although not yet coming to a head in the form of civil war. And in an effort to end this tension, the ruling families of Athens elected a man named Dracon to codify the laws. His major accomplishment was taking away the arbitrary dispensing of justice and making it more objective. What he did began a process that would lead ultimately to the classical legal system of Athens, and with it other innovations such as things that we take for granted in our society, trial by jury and arbitration. We might even note parallels with America, for example, where the arbitrary nature of justice in the old Wild West of shoot your opponent or hang them high, hang the rustler first, eventually grew into a more formalized code that we live by today. Dracon also gives us a word in our English language. There's going to be many examples of this as we see going forward, where the Greeks give us etymologies. The word draconian, meaning a law or a system of administration of some kind or another, anything really that is too severe or harsh. And we get that idea right away. That he started off his system in some very harsh manner. And that is, in fact, very much the case. He did, because he made the penalty for almost every crime death. And we will be looking at him in lecture number 2. The Greeks may have had a brilliant civilization, but there were downsides to it and to them when it came to interference in other states. In other words, the third topic that I want to talk about in our course, and that is warfare and imperialism. The era of the Persian Wars from about 480 BC down to about 479/478 BC was a great one for Greeks because, for the most part, they were able to unite with themselves, amongst themselves, and defeat the foreign king Xerxes, the great king of Persia, who had planned on adding Greece basically to the Persian Empire as a province. This was the Persian Wars, of course, and in which we have the famous Battle of Thermopylae with the 300 Spartans, that great movie that came out a long time ago, 15 years ago or so. Hopefully many of you have seen it, just so you know what I'm talking about. Although at one point, everybody in class would have seen it. Now, I guess the years have gone by. Many people may not know about it anymore. But okay, but the point was that this is a well-known moment in Greek history, the Battle of Thermopylae with the 300 Spartans. And we will be studying it, except you will be fascinated to learn there weren't just 300 Spartans there. There were other Greeks that fought alongside them, quite a few, in fact. But you'll have to wait to the Persian War lecture to find out more about that. But in the end, it was actually a defeat for the Greeks at the Battle of Thermopylae, and the Persians won that battle. But they ultimately did lose the war. The Persians ultimately were defeated and driven out of Greece, and that victory for the Greeks lay the seeds of Athenian imperialism, because the Athenians, after their great victory against the Persians, created a league, which soon turned into basically a 5th century empire for the Athenians that rode roughshod over all of their allies and their autonomy. We will be studying this in great detail. The imperialistic policies of Athens' leaders, especially that fellow named Pericles I just introduced you to, would lead ultimately to the Great Peloponnesian War of 431 to 404 BC against Sparta. And this was a civil war, essentially, that ripped Greece apart. The Peloponnesian War, in that sense, has nothing in common with the Persian Wars. Those wars had been fought against a common foe for the freedom and autonomy of all the Greeks, something that the Greeks believed in and would die for, would unite for. But in the Peloponnesian War, this latter war between Athens and Sparta, we see the influence of leaders steering states to war for their own agendas. You probably can think of a few parallels today, and I'll let you make them. But the twist is that today we talk of a common foe that is foreign, whereas Greeks saw other Greeks in their history and in the Peloponnesian War often as their enemy. That is an interesting characteristic that we will see again and again, that for us, we look at the Greeks all as a single body, but for themselves, they saw each other of their states as rivals, as not non-Greeks, but definitely enemies. So our course traces the origins and developments of these 3 categories, I keep saying, democracy, law, and imperialism, and it examines their workings against the backdrop of Greek history and society. And I hope you will find this interesting, it will compare and contrast ancient practices with our own contemporary world. That is such an important aspect of studying ancient history, and really one of the most rewarding aspects is that it gives us an insight into our own politics. It gives us an insight into our own world that we live in, and that we can critique and we can understand better because we know the ancient precedents. Well, I hope I've whetted your appetite from what I've been saying so far. My aim by the time we finish our course is that you'll have learned a lot of new stuff about the Greeks, and you'll have rethought maybe some of your views on the Greeks that you might have had earlier. I'm always in favor of rethinking one's views. And I keep talking about the Greeks as a whole, but let me expand on this point that I just made a moment ago. Because, as I said, the Greeks saw each other in different parts of the Greek world as foreigners, or as different, or enemies even. And the Greeks were found all over the place. There was no what we know of as Greece nowadays is a very, very small fraction of what was the ancient Greek world. We have Greeks on the mainland. Um, uh, Obviously, right centered around here. You're going to be learning a lot of Greek geography in this course. But you also have Greeks very, very far afield. You have Greeks over in southern Italy. You have Greeks in Sicily, even in southern France. The city that is known as Marseille, where the Marseillaise comes from, it was actually an ancient Greek colony going back to the 8th century, Massilia. And you also have Greeks in the Black Sea region, all the way up in southern Ukraine, and the area that was taken over by Russia about 7 years ago, 2014. This is the area of Crimea that was actually part of the wider Greek world. There's lots of Greek ruins there. Turkey, of course, was entirely populated by Greeks. There were some non-Greek people there too, but Greeks were all over the place. And you get the idea. They may have even gone as far west as Spain, actually, too. For the purpose of our course, though, we really have to focus exclusively on the mainland, okay? And for the most part, on Athens, actually, as well. We know that there were many cities throughout the Mediterranean that were Greek, and archaeology shows us that they were wealthy and cultured, but we know next to nothing about what went on in them. And this is because little or no literary sources have survived from those places, either from them or written about them. You see the ruins of a temple, for instance, in Crimea, and that tells you it was a temple. You can look at the style and so on, and but it doesn't tell you about the history or the society of that place. And when we are bereft of this sort of information, we are almost entirely in the dark. A temple just becomes then a bunch of stones. Almost all of our literary source material comes from Athens. This is perhaps because it was the major intellectual and cultural center in the Greek world. It was certainly the most important imperial power in the classical period. And because perhaps there are so many new aspects of society came into being there, people flocked to it, kind of like it was sort of like what New York was throughout the latter half of the 20th century. And as a result, more writers wrote about it than basically anywhere else in Greece. And that's why we focus on Athens. Just think about it. In a city that had a population of, who knows, it's controversial, but say 75,000 to maybe as much as 125, if not 150,000 people. All of this vast intellectual output came from there. Now, I don't know if there was anything else, remotely comparable to it, even in later periods. Oftentimes, this in later antiquity, cities such as Alexandria or Antioch, oftentimes kind of reach the status of being, of course, Rome ultimately will reach a status where there are major intellectual output coming there. But really, Athens is a special thing all throughout the entirety of ancient history. And so we're going to focus on it in our course. We're also going to be dealing with only two of the standard three periods of Greek history. That is the Archaic period and the classical periods of Greek history. And this is a time span from the middle of the 8th century BC, so say 750 BC, to exactly 323 BC. The Archaic period begins, as I say, in 750 BC with what we call the 8th century Renaissance, which we'll be talking about later tonight. And it runs to the end of the Persian Wars in 478 BC. And that is the subject of our lectures 9 and 10. It is called the Archaic period because, in contrast to the period before it, the so-called Dark Ages of Greece, new things were starting to happen. that is in the Archaic period, such as advances in pottery styles, the first Olympic Games, the Greek alphabet came into being, and the Iliad and the Odyssey were written down, as well as other archaic works like that of Hesiod. Colonies were beginning to be established all over the place, as far afield as the Black Sea and the Western Mediterranean, as I've already indicated. But especially for us in the Archaic period, we have the origins of democracy and law. The classical period runs from the end of the Persian Wars in 478 to the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. And this period, the classical period, is distinguished from the earlier period, that is the Archaic period, because the classical takes up the innovations of the Archaic period and brings them to fruition. Artistically and culturally, this was the golden age of Greek civilization. And for our purposes, it's also the time when the democratic and legal systems were fully developed. Militarily, the Persian Wars that ended the Archaic period heralded the dawn of a new era, because they were Greece's coming of age as a military power. And it is this military power that polarized in the oppressive empires of Athens and Sparta during the 5th and 4th centuries BC, until ultimately we get the rise of Macedonia under Philip II and his son Alexander III, the so-called Great. The classical period, therefore, will be the subjects of lectures 7 through 13 in our course. And then there are more lectures, therefore you can see there are more lectures on it because there's just so much going on. There's a lot more going on. Let me turn actually to the arrangement of the lectures. Given that the Archaic and Classical periods fall so neatly into two, and that the origins of things in the first lead to their development and maturity in the second, I have organized the contents of our course chronologically and thematically by these two periods. So, for example, since the 8th century Renaissance officially kicks off the Archaic period, it makes sense to devote a lecture to it, and that is what we'll be talking about now. We'll cover the origins and we will set the stage now, I should say. And in our next lecture, we will cover the origins and early developments of democracy and law, which one could argue characterize the Archaic period. This would be in lectures 2 through 6. And it is in this period that we see the unique development of one place that I call the odd man out state of Greece, Sparta. You can't study Athenian imperialism in any detail without knowing about Sparta. So all of lecture 5 will discuss the rise of Sparta to influence in Greece and what made it different, really, from other states. And at that point, we will be on the cusp of the classical period. And the next set of lectures, starting with lecture 7, will get us there. They will deal with the Persian Wars, that is that transition period, as I've already explained, between the Archaic to the Classical period. And at that point, we can then set the stage where democracy was developing in Greece. People were getting used to it. The legal system was developing. But all these things were still at an infancy stage. They will grow up and mature in the Classical period, though, as we will see. And unfortunately, tensions between states, especially Athens and Sparta, were also rising in the Archaic period even, and they too will grow up, or rather escalate, in the Classical period. So in lecture 7, as I said, we will discuss the rise of Athenian imperialism, the Great Peloponnesian War, and then some radical political developments in Athens. The 4th century BC is going to be a dramatic one for the Greeks with the rise of Macedonia. Greek history would never be the same again. The Athenians do bounce back from their defeat in the Peloponnesian War. And I just gave away the end, I'm sorry, but they do lose their war with Sparta. But they do bounce back, and they put together a 4th century empire. And it is in this period that their judicial system comes to maturity, which we will discuss in detail. The Athenians invented things, as I said before, like trial by jury, arbitration, and third-party intervention. And I'm also going to argue that in them, that is the Greeks, we have the origins of the modern attorney as well. Our final 2 lectures will deal with the 4th century Macedonian imperialism under Philip II, who ended Greek autonomy, and then under his son Alexander the Great. And then our final lecture will also look at Greek history kind of slightly after our period. We'll wrap up with Alexander, and also we'll look forward to Greek history after our period, and we will ask questions that our course has raised and what we can take away from it. So in a nutshell, that's what our whole course is about. And now I'd like to move on to the second part of my introductory remarks here, to set the scene, as it were, for the Archaic period by looking at the origins of some of the things that the Greeks of the mainland adapted over the centuries, well before the 8th century BC, that is the start of the Archaic period. The Greeks had had a flourishing civilization, which modern scholars call the Bronze Age. And this is the age of mythology and the Trojan War. This Bronze Age lasted from roughly 3000 BC to 1150 BC. And it's called the Bronze Age because bronze was commonly used for making weapons, tools, domestic utensils, and so on. There are many important Bronze Age palaces throughout the Greek world, on the mainland and also on Crete, where we have the Minoans, also on the islands of the Cyclades, the Cycladic Islands, which are to be found in this general area down here. Also onto Cyprus, which you can, unfortunately, you cannot see on this map, but it's just right over off an island off to the side here, and even further afield into the Near East. You could have an entire course just on the Bronze Age. I'm sure people probably do it at Fordham. And I can't do it justice in the rest of these few minutes that I have for this introductory part. So I'll just kind of cut it off by saying, because we are focusing on the Greek mainland, what I want to do is simply talk only about those aspects of the Bronze Age mainland that are most useful for us to know about, because once we get a handle on those issues, we can see how they were taken up in the Archaic period. Okay. The Bronze Age civilization of the Greek mainland is called Mycenaean. And it was called that, Mycenaean, after the city known as Mycenae, which was, according to legend, ruled over by Agamemnon. This is supposedly the death mask of Agamemnon. This was the Agamemnon who led the Greeks against Troy in about 1184 BC to retrieve Helen, his brother Menelaus' wife. Of course, I'm sure you all know the story of the Trojan War. Helen was kidnapped by Paris, the son of Priam of Troy, and the Greeks wanted her back. And so therefore hers was the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium. And that is, there began the famous 10-year Trojan War. Now, it was in the final year of that war that Homer set his Iliad, the first piece of Western literature that we have written down, and one of the greatest poems to ever have proceeded from the mind of man. And this poem, this Iliad, this epic tale, is about the return of the hero, about the destruction of, it's about what takes place in the final year of Troy. Interestingly enough, we do not see the destruction of Troy in the Iliad, the Trojan horse, or even the death of Achilles, the main character. None of that actually takes place in the Iliad, despite what many people might think who have never read it. And then, of course, the second work that is attributed to Homer, that is of the return of the hero Odysseus from Troy. This is the story of the Odyssey. Okay, so in fact, we're going to see that the Trojan War myth is one of the most returned to locuses of myth in all of Greek literature, and Greek tragedy is constantly being referred to in many other subsequent genres of Greek literature. The Trojan War is just constantly being brought up and being used as a reference point. And throughout the Bronze Age period, monarchic power was the norm. Bronze Age Greece was ruled by kings. Mycenaean Greece, like the other areas of the Bronze Age period, was comprised of a number of palaces, each headed by a king with a bureaucracy. The king was responsible for the political, military, economic, and religious life at his palace, and hence he was in charge of the area that it dominated. That didn't necessarily make him the chief priest or the commander of the troops, as other men in the court hierarchy seem to have had those sorts of functions. But because of his position, he may have been something akin to a kind of like figurehead, something akin to sort of the well, figurehead is too strong of a position. It's really something like the president of the United States, who is the commander in chief of the troops, but he is so only ex officio. In other words, the king was by his rank commander in chief, and perhaps he kind of was the chief person to oversee overall the religious functions in the state. But there were others in the hierarchy who actually did the nuts and bolts that were part of those jobs. Each palace was autonomous, and each palace was the administrative and economic center of the area in which it was situated. In other words, it was the capital of the towns and villages that existed around it. Archaeological evidence shows that the Mycenaean palaces were very large and that the people had great artistic ability and wealth. Mycenaean society was also very warlike. That makes it very different from other Bronze Age societies, for example, Minoan Crete. We know that Mycenaean society was warlike because of the grave goods that had been found there, always arms and armor, plus the fact that Mycenaean palaces had very thick fortification walls, and they were strategically built on top of hills in case of attack. In other words, a palace site was determined by the height of a hill to give the best views. Hence, a high fortified citadel became most important. And that is indeed why Athens was the most important city in Attica, the area in which it is located. So I'll be talking a lot about this. So Attica is the kind of peninsula down here, and Athens, the city, is right in there. Okay. The reason why Athens, the city, was chosen was because during the Bronze Age and afterwards, as we'll see, the citadel or the Acropolis, the high point of the city, was the place around which the entire city was built. It was the natural place to go and flee if a bunch of invaders all of a sudden showed up. And I'll just say right now, actually, that although Athens, of course, would become the most famous place in all of ancient Greece, Athens at this point, early on, was certainly not on par with the big power centers at Mycenae, as you see here in the Peloponnesus, and this whole area down here, this whole peninsula itself is called the Peloponnesus. And so Mycenae is part of it. And also other places like Pylos, which is referred to many times. It's the home of Nestor in the Iliad or the Odyssey, if you're familiar with that. And southward points as well. Anything down here on Crete. So Athens is really kind of a backwater at this time. Now, what I would like to do is I'd like to transition now to a short film that will detail a question that many, many people have tried to investigate over the years as to what finally brought about the downfall of Bronze Age civilization, not just in Greece, but all throughout the Near Eastern world as well. Because it all seems to collapse right around the middle of the 12th century or so, or even earlier on in the 12th century, sometimes the first half of the 12th century BC. We have a complete collapse of Bronze Age society in Greece and throughout the Near East. And that turning off of the lights basically will set the stage for the next several hundred years that take place before the Archaic period of Greece, which we're going to study, look at later on this evening.
For archaeologists, the picture of the past is painted by the objects left behind. The treasures of King Tut's tomb, the mighty towers of the Greek palace of Knossos, and the pottery and stone reliefs that depict both vast riches and endless warfare. This was the ancient world of 1300 BC, the Bronze Age, named for the metallurgy of its weapons. Stretching from Egypt to the Black Sea, the ancient world was an alloy forged of divergent and powerful nations, dominated by kings and their armies. The Mycenaeans and the Minoans, the heroes of Homeric legend, built their palaces in Greece, Crete, and the Aegean Islands. The pharaoh Ramses, thought to be the pharaoh of the Old Testament, changed the very landscape with his monument at Karnak. The warring Hittites, biblical enemies of Egypt, dominated what is now Turkey and northern Syria. while the Canaanites, the merchants of the Great Trade Route, controlled what would become the Holy Land, Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. It was a world made of many kingdoms, leagues apart, distinct in design and culture. Yet when archaeologists first began excavating this territory in the 1930s, a disturbing pattern began to emerge.
What we've got is a series of destructions. Most of the main cities, towns, palaces are destroyed for one reason or another.
Though evidence of destruction was widespread, in nearly every instance, the period of the collapse was the same: the years surrounding 1200 BC.
In this 50-year period, we've got at least 4 major civilizations that go down. Mycenaeans disappear, Minoans disappear, Hittites disappear, the Canaanites to a large extent disappear, and Egypt is so weakened that it's really never the same again. That's what's so amazing about this, is these are the biggest guys in the world, and they all bite the dust at about the same time, within a generation or two.
The Ramessid period starts off very strong with some of the most spectacular building and just incredible wealth. And then there are little cracks in the whole fabric of the society, economically, religion. You can just see things sort of going downhill. In the reign of Ramses III, there's tremendous inflation. We see the monuments become smaller in scale. We also see huge economic problems with the tax base of the country, because so much of the taxable land had been removed from the tax rolls. Many people believe that from this time, the Egyptians no longer have the great self-confidence they had before the gods. We see a whole new genre of petitions to the gods, these prayers asking for, please God, help me, which we never saw before this time.
After a century of progress, which saw the development of the first alphabetic writing in Ugarit in 1300 BC and the first musical notation in Syria, the written record abruptly ends. What follows will be given an ominous name: the Dark Age.
The Dark Ages in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean have 2 connotations. One is, for the ancients, they lost most of the hallmarks of civilization. It's called that in part because civilization, as we know it, disappears for a couple of hundred years. They forget how to write in Greece. They forget how to do large buildings, massive architecture, and it takes 200 or 300 years to come up out of this. But it's also a dark period for us.
Without written records, archaeologists were baffled by the evidence of mass migrations throughout the ancient world, all dating to 1200 BC. On the island of Crete, tradesmen and merchants poured out of the coastal settlements, pushing inland to the mountainous lands worked by the farmers and shepherds.
In the North Isthmus, the area right behind me here, it appears that there was almost no settlement at all, or perhaps a small scattering of small villages in the Mycenaean period. The population is very thin. By the 12th century, the population grows considerably. But where this population is coming from and why exactly is not entirely clear.
The destruction in the cities they left behind gives mute testimony that this was no peaceful exodus.
It can be very difficult to determine the cause of a destruction. When you're digging, it's pretty obvious something's been destroyed. You've got fire, you've got ash, you've got burnt wood, you've got skeletons. But what actually caused the destruction?
The answer may not lie in the rubble of these palaces, but in the mountains high above them. One archaeologist would dedicate his life to following the clues, rediscovering the ancient pathways up the sheer cliffs of the Aegean. It is here that he will follow in the footsteps of the survivors, hoping at last to discover how and why their world collapsed. For decades, it remained a mystery, the sudden collapse of the great coastal cities and palaces of the ancient world in 1200 BC. What could have caused it? Most investigators dug through the ruins of mighty cities for clues. But the real evidence would be found further inland, in the distant mountains and valleys of the Aegean islands, where humble farmers and shepherds once cultivated barley, lentils, and olive trees. All that changed in the summer of 1983, when Polish archaeologist Krzysztof Nowicki, then a 26-year-old doctoral student, first climbed the mountain of Karfi on the island of Crete. Nowicki's original goal was to study a Neolithic religious shrine constructed at its summit by prehistoric peoples. But once there, nearly 4,000 feet above sea level, Nowicki was riveted by another set of ruins, a mountaintop village that had been partially excavated and abandoned by the famed British archaeologist John Pendlebury in the 1930s. Having experienced one of the frigid winters atop Karfi, Pendlebury suggested it was merely a temporary or seasonal settlement. But to Nowicki, the ruins, made of large blocks of stone, looked like something else entirely.
What is interesting about the houses in Karfi, that they are pretty well constructed. This way of construction suggests that these people were prepared to live in this village for a long time, and that these were their permanent houses.
By mapping out and reconstructing the settlement from the excavated footprint, Nowicki was able to confirm his suspicion.
The excavation revealed at least 25 to 30 houses. At the moment, these remains are in a very bad state of preservation, but we still can trace the walls and we still can trace the rooms and particular individual houses. Karfi was a big village. It was not a small settlement. It was a village inhabited probably by 120 to 150 families, about 600 to 1,200 people.
The reconstructed village, some 3,800 feet above sea level, seemed strangely out of place.
We should not expect a big village situated on this rock and on such altitude. Now we are sitting in the sun. There is probably 35 degrees. But if we came here in the winter, it is a very, very windy, very cold place. It is not very pleasant to live here.
What would a permanent settlement be doing so far above the normal sites on the lower hillsides and plains?
We have to ask why people move to these places, why people build their houses in the places difficult to climb up, why they decided to move their families to these houses, why they moved their entire economic system up to these places, to the high mountains.
Though Pendlebury had thought it was a more primitive site, Nowicki's carbon dating of pottery and other artifacts placed it squarely in the time of the Bronze Age catastrophe, 1200 BC.
Before 1200 BC, we still have people living close to the sea, on the plains, in the valleys. Shortly before 1200 BC, we see that many of these low-situated places were either destroyed or abandoned.
The inevitable question was, what would force these populations to move from the coasts to the mountains? Nowicki returned to the historical and archaeological record, but could find no consensus on what caused such sudden and dramatic changes.
There are all kinds of crazy theories out there to explain the end of the late Bronze Age. Comets, volcanoes, aliens, you name it, people have said it.
But most hypotheses revolved around the ever-present threat of natural disaster.
One of the main suggestions has been drought. that there was a major drought across the entire Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, and perhaps even up to Europe, and that starts tribes migrating. The level of the water of the Mediterranean had dropped significantly at the end of the Late Bronze Age.
Another possibility was the devastating earthquakes that regularly jolt the region.
We've got a number of sites in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean destroyed by earthquake within a 50-year span at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Mycenae is destroyed by earthquake. Troy 6 is destroyed by earthquake. Ugarit may be destroyed by an earthquake. Megiddo in Israel may be destroyed by an earthquake. The problem with saying that a single earthquake destroyed all of these sites and brought the Late Bronze Age to an end is that these sites are destroyed at different times during the 50-year period.
Though the timing of the earthquakes differs, they could still be related.
There is something that geophysicists today call an earthquake sequence or an earthquake storm, in which an earthquake will not relieve all of the stress in a fault, but will simply release part of the stress. And so the next part in the fault will go a year later, 10 years later, and then the fault unzips from east to west or west to east or north to south. And we eventually get what's called an earthquake sequence or an earthquake storm. And these last between 30 and 60 years. Many of the cities that are destroyed by earthquakes are either on a fault line or in a seismically active zone. In fact, if you lay a map of the sites that are destroyed at the end of the Late Bronze Age by earthquake on top of a map of seismically active zones, they will correlate on very nearly a one-to-one basis.
But the earthquake theory has always had its detractors.
People recover from earthquakes fairly quickly. That's pretty much proven. Even repeated earthquakes.
And to Nowitzki, no natural disaster explained why a population would move to an even more precipitous place.
There's no way that people would move their village 1,100 meters to the top of this rock. Why? Escaping from the earthquakes and living on the edge of the rock? We don't see the people running away from natural disasters. So it makes no sense.
To Nowitzki, these unlikely and inhospitable heights appear to be a place of last resort, a defensible refuge designed to offer protection not from nature, but from a human enemy.
I mean, there is no reason to live on the ledges, hanging above the gorge or on the rocky knolls, other than a real threat from some other people.
If Nowitzki's theory about the Aegean apocalypse is correct, there should be dozens of refuge sites waiting to be discovered in the high mountains of Crete, hidden in treacherous settlements unseen for generations. If he can find them, they will reveal details of a life and death struggle between the survivors who subsisted at these impossible heights and the enemy fearsome enough to drive them there. There are many theories as to what could have brought about the apocalypse of 1200 BC and destroyed the mighty Bronze Age of the Hittites, Canaanites, Mycenaeans, and Minoans. Some have blamed natural disaster, disease and pestilence, even the wrath of an angry god. But could it have been a human enemy? And if so, who were these people who sent such mighty cultures tumbling into oblivion within the span of a single generation? For decades, archaeologists sifted the abundant ruins, but found only a few isolated clues. Then, in the 1930s, a stone tablet bearing a desperate message was unearthed in northern Syria. Found in the ruins of the Palace of Ugarit, destroyed by fire around 1200 BC, it was an intimation of the destruction to come.
The king of Ugarit says, "My father 7 enemy ships have been sighted. Now, they've already done great damage to my country. If you see any more, please let me know. The tablet was never sent. It was found in the kiln, ready to be fired, when obviously the enemy ships came back and destroyed the town.
Who was this enemy who came from the sea? Only one culture, Egypt, survived the collapse of the Bronze Age to give this enemy a name. Ancient hieroglyphics tell of a terrifying foe, the warriors known only as the Sea Peoples.
We get all of our details about what the Sea Peoples look like and their mode of transportation from the Egyptians. In addition to the texts that the Egyptians put up on their walls, they also put up pictorial scenes. And so they actually show us what the Sea Peoples look like. We can see the type of helmets they wear, the type of headdresses they wear. We can see them moving in ox carts, in some cases with their families, wives and children and possessions.
This was a mass movement that was affecting all the ancient cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean. And this was something that had never happened before. Every single culture in that area, even the ones as well established and as powerful as Egyptians, were being really shaken by this movement of the Sea People. Because part of it is they were coming not only to attack, but to settle.
This is what archaeologist Krzysztof Nowicki had envisioned when he first looked at the ruins high atop Carfi. A desperate people, the shepherds and farmers of the valleys driven into the mountains they knew so well. But could he prove that Carfi was no anomaly, but simply one example in the systematic evacuation of an entire people? It was a theory Nowicki would spend the next 20 years putting to the test. Traveling alone and with only the most minimal of supplies, he methodically scaled mountaintops so steep that he often had to cling to the cliff face or find ancient footholds carved into the rock to navigate the shifting beds of loose shale. And it is here, at these impossible heights, that he found what would be his greatest discovery, the mountaintop settlement of Katalimata. The site can only be reached by ascending an incline of loose stone, then clinging to an almost invisible path along the cliff face. In 1990, he took American archaeologist Donald Haggis with him as a witness.
This one is extraordinary. The site itself is built on these sharply formed precipitous limestone cliffs above the plain, and you have to get to it by climbing a scree slope and then entering the gorge from the outer face by a narrow entrance path.
The artifacts found at the site paint a picture of a people living on the edge. These simple country inlanders, shepherds and farmers by trade, would have had to move all their possessions one by one up these steep mountain trails. The old and the infirm would have had to have been carried, their dead buried in tombs carved out of the mountaintops. Livestock and their fields had to be left below, to be tended only when conditions were safe enough to allow it.
The evidence that we recovered during surveys suggests that they were using the settlement probably for a considerable period. It's an uncomfortable site to live in. It's not conducive to settlement expansion.
Though life atop Katalimata would have been extremely difficult, it would have had one advantage: protection.
This place can be a nightmare for strangers, for foreigners. Without this knowledge of local topography, it's really very difficult to climb them and to find them.
They're like fortresses, in a sense, utilizing the natural terrain, and sometimes, as a lot of research out here is showing, not just utilizing the terrain, but utilizing fairly effective fortification walls as well.
Any enemy trying to invade the settlement would have been visible for miles, allowing the mountain people to make preparations. The invaders themselves would have been forced to approach single file, making it impossible to hold their weapons while clinging to the cliff face.
Even if they found a way, then it was very easy to stop them. Even a few men could stop a much stronger group of intruders, of enemies here on these narrow ledges.
Katalymata was only the first of many refuge sites that Nowitzki discovered. After scaling nearly 2,000 mountains in Crete, he identified 80 different refuge sites that dated to 1200 BC. One common unifying factor in the orientation and design of these settlements convinced him the enemy they were built to withstand was the Sea Peoples.
How do we know that these people were afraid of the people coming from the sea and not that they were afraid of their neighbors? This can be done only by analyzing how these settlements were defended. Carfi is completely open from the area of the mountains behind it. So we know that they didn't expect the enemy coming from these mountains. These places were settled because they were afraid of the people coming from the sea.
The influx of these sea peoples would change the face of the ancient world. But who were they exactly?
We've got three major questions. Who are they? Where'd they come from? And where'd they go to?
History, they say, is written by the winners. And in the year 1180 BC, the pharaoh Ramses claimed victory over the Sea Peoples, the mysterious warriors that some believed had destroyed all the other kingdoms of the ancient world. Ramses alone remained to give archaeologists the most tantalizing clue to the identity of these raiders. In a memorial carved at Medinet Habu, the Egyptians identify 9 factions of Sea Peoples, a list that continues to baffle linguists.
Most of the theories about where the Sea Peoples came from are dependent on the philology, the actual names of their groups, and that can be very dangerous territory. The Shekelesh are frequently said to be from Sicily. Did they come from Sicily, or did they go to Sicily after they lost?
For decades, scholars have argued over the origin of the Sea Peoples. Some point to southeastern Turkey, northern Syria, and the eastern Mediterranean as a likely launch point. Others contended the Sea Peoples most likely came from Sicily, Sardinia, Italy, and the western and the central Mediterranean.
Do the Sea Peoples come from the east and move west, or do they come from the west and move east? We don't know.
Were these really 9 nations of foreign invaders? Or was this an attack that actually started much closer to home? One theory holds that it was the very structure of the ancient world that made it vulnerable to terrorism from within, a world built around palaces and omnipotent kings.
The king would control most everything. There would be some private merchants and private enterprise, but mostly the king runs the government, the king runs the army, king is going to run the international trade, certainly in charge of the diplomatic powers. So you're in a situation where the palace pretty much controls 75 to 90% of daily life.
In many places, it seems the kings and queens lived with the gods. The kings and queens were the human representatives of the deities. These deities are statues. And then there is the army, the professional army, under the kings and queens. And then there's everybody else. And everybody else was supposed to keep and wanted to keep the gods and the kings and queens satisfied.
The only place for the laborers and peasants outside this system was in the king's massive armies. And even there, they played a subservient role in the service of the charioteers.
The typical battle in the late Bronze Age seems to have been the charge of 2 chariotries against each other. Each chariotry might be numbered in the hundreds or possibly the thousands. And the chariot crew was heavily armored, and that was the main weapon, the composite bow. And so the fighting was mostly at long range. But of course, after they'd hit a target and brought an opposing chariot to a stop, then somebody had to go and finish off that crew. And that's where the so-called runners came in, the barbarians who were hired to act as cleanup crews in a chariot battle.
These anonymous groups of hired mercenaries were recruited from the poorest parts of the ancient world.
The tablets that we have make it very clear that the palaces took very good care of the charioteers. They knew every charioteer by name, and these people seem to have been an elite. The runners seem to have been counted rather than named. They have so many hired from here and hired from there. There was a real difference in the social class of these people.
As long as there were conflicts, there was a place for these foot soldiers. But in the years leading up to the Great Collapse, there was an unprecedented period of peace.
The country was more or less at peace because of the great treaty between the Hittites and Ramses II.
It would be the equivalent of after World War I or after World War II, with the various powers signing a peace treaty. This effectively brought an end to warfare between two of the greatest powers of the day, and we get half a century or so of peace. It certainly was one of the true high points of the ancient world, and then it all comes crashing down.
Did the fact that there was little employment for these lower-class runners lead to an uprising? Or were these out-of-work warriors recruited by an outside enemy?
And these warriors, now without the central authority, were either on their own or they were under the supervision of these local chieftains. They could do whatever they wanted. Nobody could catch them.
The Egyptian record suggests it was a changing coalition that raided the power centers of the ancient world for more than 50 years.
We've got indications in the Egyptian records themselves that there were successive waves of sea peoples. Almost certainly there's a change in the makeup of the group between the first and the second invasion. They're definitely working together as a coalition, but I don't think that they began that way. What we're seeing is the end result. It's the final wave that's washing up against Egypt.
And as the Egyptian reliefs show, the so-called sea peoples are armed in much the same way as the native chariot runners would have been.
They were not heavily armored. In fact, any kind of armor would have slowed them down and probably made them less effective on the battlefield. And so they carried small round shields with leather over a wooden frame. And they wore a helmet. I'm not sure whether the helmet was practical or not, but I think it had a good psychological effect on them.
Though the exact origin of these warriors may never be identified, archaeologist Krzysztof Nowicki thinks he has found one of the flashpoints. At Castri, on the coast of Crete, Nowicki has identified remnants of a settlement unlike the many inland refuge sites he has explored. On this relatively accessible hilltop are the remains of battlements that, to Nowicki's eye, suggest an experienced battle force.
The people who lived here were not the normal farmers or shepherds. It's too dangerous. I mean, a small group of farmers couldn't defend it. Any invaders, any raiders would easily take this settlement.
The topography of Castri provides several strategic advantages, providing easy access to the coast of Crete, Italy, and nearby islands.
We may estimate probably 2 or 3, 4 boats here, maybe about 50 to 100 or even 200 men, which was enough to invade, to raid the coastal places in Crete.
If Nowitzki is correct, the Sea Peoples were not the last to understand the strategic advantage of Castri. In the 1940s, this same hillside was taken by Nazi invaders in their own attempt to dominate the island. But while the German troops were driven from these hills, the Sea Peoples overran Crete and the Aegean.
The extent of destruction, especially in Anatolia, in central Greece, doesn't suggest to me a disorganized group. It suggests a rather efficient military machine.
But whether this force represents outside invaders, disgruntled local warriors, or some combination of the two, the question remains the same.
What's amazing about all this is that this ragtag group of marauders and pirates managed to knock off the best of the civilizations, and how they managed to do it is still the major question.
The answer may lie not in the nature of the Sea Peoples, but in their ways of warfare. "1,200 years before the birth of Christ, an inexorable force changed the very landscape of the ancient world. Evidence of its power was written in the toppled ruins of Mycenaean cities and the abandoned palaces of kings. The desperation of those who survived could be seen in the precarious outposts they built atop the mountains of Crete. These mighty civilizations, from the Minoans to the Hittites, survived pestilence, famine, and earthquakes, only to fall to a human enemy, a mysterious force of barbarians called the Sea Peoples. But these invaders had no chariots, no armor. How could they take on the armies of the kings? The answer would change the nature of warfare forever."
Late in the 13th century, it finally dawned on somebody that you didn't need these expensive chariots and chariot teams in order to win a battle. If you got enough runners together, and they were cheap, and they themselves have the capacity to annihilate a chariot army.
One weapon would make it possible to turn these runners into formidable warriors. A simple armament that until the collapse had been used primarily for hunting.
The javelin's a fairly short weapon, probably 4 feet, and has a small metal head. I don't think that these were lethal most of the time, but they certainly would wound whatever they hit.
As the raiders rushed the disabled chariot, the well-protected charioteer would have been suddenly vulnerable.
The charioteer and the chariot archer both wore a corselet with scale armor that might have weighed between 30 and 45 pounds. So obviously they cannot run, and they are in no position to defend themselves in hand-to-hand combat.
It is at this point that a swarm of raiders, armed with short swords and lightweight shields, would have had the advantage, both in numbers and mobility.
That's all you'd need to do, wound a horse, and that chariot is stopped. If they could, at 40 or 50 yards, hurl their javelins and bring down a chariot horse, then they were ready to come in for close combat and hand-to-hand weapons, and at that point, the chariot crew is doomed.
With every success, the ranks of the invaders grew and spread across the Aegean. Only Egypt was able to withstand the onslaught, although the conflict would leave them forever weakened. How did the pharaoh's armies withstand an onslaught that extinguished powers like the Mycenaeans, Minoans, and the Hittites?
There's a lot of diplomatic correspondence going back and forth, and a lot of trade in especially gold leaving Egypt through Nubia, and things like horses being brought into Egypt, and various other types of commodities going back and forth. So it was a period of a lot of communication between all of these powers. They had forewarning of these people coming toward Egypt, which was a very important aspect of defense. They had moved the capital of Egypt to the northern part of the country actually to defend against these people, so they were very ready.
I think there's a good chance that the Egyptians were also getting their information through diplomatic messengers and couriers from the other great civilizations as one by one they fell. I mean, there are amazing spy systems in place in the ancient world, and the Egyptians certainly had their group of messenger spies, reporters, and so they knew what was coming before it hit them.
And by this time, the Egyptians knew that, contrary to their name, the Sea People's greatest strength was not on the water, but on shore.
The conflicts were essentially land battles, but Ramses III in 1179 had the good sense to stop these raiders, these marauders, from ever getting to land.
The Egyptian records, both the pictorial and the textual, they depict a battle taking place on the water, whether it's in a river mouth or actually out in the sea. It's hard to tell, but we've got boats, we've got drowning people. There's obviously a major battle going on the water.
They were out there in their boats, and they were helpless out there. The Egyptian archers who were stationed on the shore or on other boats, it was duck soup.
Decimated by the pharaoh's archers, the final wave of Sea Peoples was dispersed. But warfare would never be the same again.
In the late Bronze Age, the defense of a community rested on an elite, on the charioteers and the chariot archers. In the Iron Age, which follows this catastrophe, the importance of infantrymen is much greater, and charioteers have become marginal. They continue to be used for flanking operations, but they are no longer the essence. The essence is in infantry.
In the span of just a few years, the kings and armies of the ancient world were felled. In their wake, a new populace rose up.
What the Sea Peoples do is create a power vacuum. When the Sea Peoples knocked off the top dogs of the late Bronze Age, they create a whole new situation. It's going to be the elite that go away, that are destroyed. The underclass, the middlemen, the farmers, the peasants, the slaves, they may well survive. And then what are they going to do?
In the case of the shepherds and farmers and refugees of Crete, the archaeological record is clear. After the defeat and dispersal of the Sea Peoples, the hardened survivors gradually returned to the lowlands.
After 1200 BC, and as soon as the times became safer, people moved down to another ridge, which is about 1 kilometer, 1.5 kilometers from here, lower and closer to their fields.
Never again would they feel the need to build settlements at such heights. But the final fate of the warriors known as the Sea Peoples may never be known.
The Egyptians themselves say that they settled some of the remnants in either Egypt itself or in Canaan. And we know that later Egyptian texts talk about the city of Dor in Israel being a Tejeker city. We know that the Peleset settle down in Canaan. They become the Philistines.
Some believe that these survivors and the remnants of the Sea Peoples may have intermingled, something future DNA testing of the remains found in the tombs may reveal.
We've probably got remnants of the very civilizations that the Sea Peoples had destroyed while en route to Egypt. So we may well have Mycenaeans among the Sea Peoples, Minoans among the Sea Peoples, Hittites or Luca among the Sea Peoples. And it may well have been one of the few opportunities left to them was to join the Sea Peoples.
What is undeniable is that after the fall, something entirely new emerged.
We're going to get dark ages for a couple of centuries as the melting pot is remixed. But up out of this, out of the ashes, rise the phoenix of the Greeks. We get new political systems and new civilizations in effect. The Greeks rise up and we get things that will eventually become democracy as we know it.
With the worst of motives, these sea people had destroyed one world, but obviously they opened up opportunities for people who had never had opportunities before.
We get the Israelites and David and Solomon, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, which may not have been able to exist unless the mighty kingdoms of the late Bronze Age had been done away with. So the Sea Peoples, in effect, bring about the demise of the old and the rise of the new.
The exact chain of events that brought an end to one age and gave rise to another is still being investigated.
I don't think Christoph has the answer, but he's getting close. He's getting close to finding the answer.
What I think we've really got is a combination of causes. The Sea Peoples got lucky. Their timing was perfect. They take advantage of some of perhaps the natural disasters. If a drought had occurred, if a series of earthquakes had just occurred, we get what archaeologists refer to as a systems collapse, where one or two factors, which in and of themselves would not have caused the collapse of civilization, when they're put together, create a magnification effect. The Sea Peoples are able to exploit a hole in the defenses of these mighty civilizations where none had existed before.
As archaeologists sift the clues to this ancient destruction that occurred so abruptly, they may find modern insights as well.
I rather doubt that the Egyptians or the Hittites expected they would fall, or at least fall quite so quickly. But when you get a series of factors that might not otherwise be related, they could come together to create a force more powerful than each of them individually. So one of the lessons we might learn for today's society is that while a drought might not be important in and of itself, or while a series of earthquakes might seem to have only a lasting impact, if you layer a couple of natural disasters on top of some man-made calamities, you may get a completely unexpected result.
The Mycenaean civilization ends around 1150 BC or so. As the movie makes really clear, the reasons aren't exactly known, but it seems to be this combination of natural disaster plus invasion, attack from outside people. We know definitely that around this time, too, begins these periods of great migrations, particularly when a group of people known as the Dorians invade from the north and penetrate as far south as the Peloponnesus, that is down here, where Sparta is. And in fact, the Spartans are Dorians. They have a slightly different form of the Greek language that they speak, the so-called Doric dialect. And combined with that, there is also an idea that there may have been some sort of civil uprising throughout the Mycenaean world, throughout the Bronze Age Greek world, where kind of non-noble families or underlings, or maybe actually even noble families, overthrow the monarchy. And as a result of that, several noble, not royal, but noble families come to exercise political power. Well, whatever the exact case of it is, of course, going back into such early times is very hard to have certainty about things. But the bottom line is that the Mycenaean age ended in a fight. And we know this because we have preserved in many places, in palaces, a form of the Greek language, an earlier Proto-Greek form known as Linear B, inscribed on tablets. And these tablets have inscribed on them all sorts of everyday information, numbers of livestock, a person's offering to the gods, lists of personnel, and so on. And they are written in this, as I say, Proto-Greek language known as Linear B. You see an example of that in front of you now, which was deciphered sometime around the middle of the 20th century by a man named Michael Ventris. You can read a very interesting life of him, the man who decoded Linear B, it's called, Michael Ventris. The common practice was to use clay tablets to write things on and later to wipe them like kind of wipe them off and reuse the tablets, kind of like smudge them off. So kind of like today, like you know, a lot of people have in their kitchen a big kind of dry erase board where they write things like what they need to buy from the grocery store and so on. And at the end of the day, they wipe it off. So these were not meant to be baked, which would then set the information on them for good. But they have survived from this period because the palaces were destroyed by fire. So you see the tablets got baked by accident in the fires. And that is a sign that the palaces met a violent end. And it won't be the first time, as we'll see, that an existing regime is toppled by force and a new order comes into being, usually the result of a civil uprising. All of those palace centers of the Bronze Age will spawn the rise of some of the cities as the chief ones in their areas. In other words, what we begin to see, and what we're going to talk about now in a moment, is the polis system, where Greece became a number of independent city-states, or polis. Linear B will so the knowledge of writing disappears at this time. That was mentioned in the movie very quickly. That all of these aspects of civilization, and particularly the use of writing, gets forgotten about during this time of violent upheaval. And it will be one of the things that will characterize the beginning of the Archaic period, when writing will be reintroduced from the Near East. But when you put it all together, we might say that these factors, the high citadels, the way that the palace centers spawn the polis, the city-states of Greece, are the most important legacies of the Bronze Age, more than pottery designs or artwork, more than expanding trade routes, because it is these things that are adopted and adapted by the later Greeks, especially the exercise of power by ruling families, by noble families. With the end of Mycenaean civilization, the period known as the Dark Ages began. And if you would like to read a book dedicated entirely to this period, it is known as the Dark Age of Ancient Greece, by a man with the wonderful name of Snodgrass. But it's sort of the standard work on this subject. Anyway, the Dark Ages begin, and this period will last from the collapse of the Bronze Age, say 1150 or so BC, to the start of the Archaic period, say around 750 BC. And it's called the Dark Ages very appropriately because we don't know a heck of a lot about what went on at this time. There were advances in pottery, there was a gradual increase in population, as we'll see, and power was in the hands of aristocratic families. So there, in other words, much of what became normal in archaic and classical Greek society came into being around this time, from the end of the Bronze Age, tracking through the Dark Age period. Much of what becomes normal in later Greek history came into being. So also, unfortunately, did the agrarian social distress from the oligarchical rule that lay at the heart of the democratic and judicial advances of the Archaic period. What I mean by that is, what was also happening during the Dark Ages was that the ruling families, who had replaced the kings of the Bronze Age period, were getting more and more oppressive, and the people, as a result, were finding it harder and harder to eke out any kind of even meager existence. And that is a scenario for civil war, because the ruling families didn't care about the mass of the people, and you could only not eat for so long before you do something about it. In summary, then, in this introductory part of tonight's lecture, we've talked about some aspects of Mycenaean civilization that find their way, with changes, admittedly, into the Archaic period. We've needed to trace those aspects to show that later Greek history didn't just suddenly spring up fully formed like Athena from Zeus's brow, but it borrowed from what went on before it. Now, what I'd like to do is to turn and discuss some of the things that we know about from the Dark Ages, and then turn to what is known as 8th century Renaissance, the start of the Archaic period proper, when history comes alive, really, and society starts to develop unlike ever before. But if we're dealing with new material and new things happening, if this Archaic period is marked by unprecedented novelty and achievement, if in it we have the origins of democracy and law, which we live by today, then you might be asking, why do we call it archaic? And let us turn to that question now. The Dark Ages are called this, as I've said before, because we don't know anything really about what happened at this time. And we cannot explain what caused some of the things that we do know about, which did happen. For example, as I said before, we don't know exactly how monarchy in the Bronze Age ended and how aristocratic families took over political power. They did, though, because they were exercising it in the Archaic period. But exactly how it happened is unknown. The Dark Ages as a whole can be subdivided into 3 periods, thanks mainly to pottery styles. For the first 100 or so years, so from about 1150 BC to 1050 BC, we have what is known as sub-Mycenaean pottery, which is of poor quality. The designs are usually, as you see in front of you, horizontal lines, circles, and so on, drawn freehand, and they often simply duplicate styles and shapes of pottery that one finds in the Bronze Age. And this decline in the quality of pottery, as it's been called, perhaps indicates that this was a period when society was still in turmoil after the collapse of the Bronze Age monarchies and any invasions that would have caused all manner of disruptions to social life. It may also explain what seems to have been a sharp population decline across most of Greece, with some communities, some townships being decimated and even abandoned. Perhaps the people fled before these invaders reached them, as we saw in the movie, people running to the hills, literally. After a century or so, things begin to look up, though, and we move to the second period in the Dark Ages, from about 1050 to, say, 900 BC. In this period, we have a style of pottery called proto-geometric. It appears first in Attica, that is the peninsula where Athens is, and then elsewhere, as I said, and lasts until about 900 BC. The style is still abstract circles, half circles, lines, and so on, but they are better drawn than on sub-Mycenaean pots, and there's a real attempt to achieve some symmetry here. And you don't really have to imagine it too much, with the squiggles and the lines, what you see in front of you drawn around the zone. There's now an attempt to make that zone equal on all sides of the pot, rather than having one zone wider or one side of the pot narrower than the other side. There's some attempt then to try to get things right, and this is an advancement, because, and it actually is an advancement that comes about because of a faster turning potter's wheel that was invented at some point during this time, and also using things like straight-edged implements to draw lines, things like rulers, as we would use. Another characteristic of this period is a slow rise in population, perhaps as people began to move back down the hillside to the areas from which their parents or even grandparents had fled or conceivably been expelled. And this then takes us to the third and final division in the Dark Ages, and that is the period from 900 to 750 BC. And in pottery, if you won't be surprised to hear that if we have proto-geometric pottery, now we have geometric style pottery, with the additions of new shapes of pots, new designs like zigzags and triangles, which fill the entire area of the vase, and not just part of it, called the zone. And we also have representations of living things, from birds to human figures. They are crudely drawn. They're akin, actually, to kind of the matchstick figures that one finds in L.S. Lowry painting from northern England. But nevertheless, this is a real step forward from what's been going on before. Indeed, this later geometric pottery is on a cusp, if you like, between the Dark Ages and the 8th century Renaissance. Apart from pottery, we also find gold and ivory carvings being made, which show further artistic achievement on the part of the craftsman. They also show two things: that the economy was taking off, otherwise people wouldn't be able to afford ivory and gold, and also that precious metals were being imported again from other countries. There's a flourishing, in other words, going on. Society all of a sudden is developing. It's beginning to become prosperous. And therefore, we're reaching the end of the Dark Ages. And it's because of this background, or rather, it's against this background, that in about 750 BC or so, we have a burst of commercial contacts between the Greek mainland and other parts of the world, especially Egypt and Syria. And we also have the sending out of colonies all over the place. All of these things mark the end of the Dark Ages. And it's no real stretch of the imagination that what follows their end is referred to, therefore, as a Renaissance. The term is obviously deliberately chosen because it really was a rebirth, just like the Renaissance of 14th century Europe, which started in Italy with the humanistic movement, Petrarch and that whole gang, and was a kind of clean break from the doom and gloom, the Black Death, and the chaos of the Middle Ages, the collapse of the feudal system, and so on. So this 8th century Renaissance in ancient Greece heralded a new dawn in Greek civilization and history, and therefore we move from the Dark Ages into real history, something that we can actually quantify with dates. And now we're going to move into the last part of our lecture for this evening, where we kind of explore that 8th century Renaissance. Two major characteristics that really show this period as a clear break from the past are, one, an increased amount of trade, especially with the West, and two, colonization. Virtually every Greek state sent out colonists to the Black Sea, the North Aegean, and the West, principally Sicily and southern Italy. Now, colonization was probably something the Greeks were forced into doing because of the growing population as people returned to the mainland. And as a result, the increasing infertility of the soil became a huge problem in supporting the growing population. Because, and this is just something that we're going to see as a theme throughout all of our talking about Greece throughout this course, apart from a few areas of Greece, especially in the north, the soil of Greece is very infertile. It's very, very rocky and thin, as you can see in the film that we watched. That most of Greece is mountainous. You don't get big open plains like you do in Oklahoma or something like that, Nebraska. So a staple crop like wheat could not be grown properly. The Athenians, for example, would always be dependent on imported wheat from the Black Sea area to meet their needs. The Greeks as a whole knew nothing about advanced methods of fertilization and so on. They didn't have anything like that, or even crop rotation or something like that. And so the population, as it increased, made the land more and more unable to support the population. And what to do? Well, one way to solve the land hunger problem was for a city to send out a colony. In Greek, the word colony is apoikia, which literally means something like home away from home. So apo is from or away, and oikos means home. So apoikia is home away from home. And apoikia consisted of a bunch of citizens headed by a leader who was called an oikistes. The word means founder. And this bunch of collection was sent out to an already determined place. It wasn't luck of the draw. They weren't pioneers in that sense. They already knew where they were going. And this city, the city that sent them out, the city from which they came, was the mother city, or metropolis, the metropolis. And it's and this mother city would have already, before they sent out their apoikia, they would have actually already gone to the Oracle of Delphi, which is right around here in mainland Greece, and they would have asked Apollo, the god of the Oracle of Delphi, we'll learn more about this later, if it was permissible to send out this colony. Consulting the oracle was an integral role that religion played in all aspects of Greek life. And this is something that we'll return to time and again as we track through Greek history in our course together. We're going to watch a whole thing about the Oracle of Delphi. It was a very, very important shrine in the Greek world. And once this colony was established, it was autonomous. The people, that is the colonists, gave up their citizenship to the metropolis, to the mother city, and only the kind of emotional ties that they had with them abided. They're purely sentimental ties like language, religion, social customs, and so on, but nothing political. In fact, as we're going to see, there will be times when the mother city and the colony will get into wars with one another. They would, though, when they were going out for their colony, take with them fire from the metropolis to start the first fire in the new colony. There was all sorts of religious hullabaloo that would take place here, symbolic kind of things. But after that, the colony was on its own. Doubtlessly, it imported goods and perhaps had things in its new area that its metropolis wanted. So this would create a kind of trade bond between the two places. The earliest wave of colonies took place in the mid-8th century BC to Italy and the West. A second wave took place about a century later to the coasts of the Hellespont, the modern Dardanelles. That this is in modern-day Turkey, right around here, and up into the Black Sea, that area in southern Ukraine, as I talked about before. The first wave, that early one, as I mentioned, in the mid-8th century, the fact that it was then supports the idea that the Greeks were opening up or enhancing their trade routes to the west. The second wave, in about 650 BC or so, supports the idea that overpopulation was forcing Greeks to search for good farming land, because this was in abundance in the Hellespont and the Black Sea areas. And these areas were, they also had abundant natural resources and even fishing. There were some Greek trading settlements, colonies, really is the wrong word in this case, that predate the mid-8th century. For example, the people of Euboea, which is a kind of long island right off the coast. You can't even see it on this map. Right over here, maybe the next one. Yeah, this is the southern part of Euboea right there, next to Athens. They had actually sent out a colony founded named Almina in northern Syria to open up trade with Syria and Mesopotamia in 825. So very early. And they followed this foundation with Pithecusae, which is just off of Naples, which is all in itself actually a Greek city. Neapolis, the new city, is a Greek word. Pithecusae is the place of the monkeys. This is also a Greek little island settlement right off of the Bay of Naples. These early trading settlements are not colonies per se. They were merely settlements of citizens sent over there to help facilitate trade. So it's the colonization movement that's really the turning point between the end of the Dark Ages and the start of the Archaic Period. I have no doubt that these early colonies that were founded with a view to trade were influenced by the Euboeans, because once Greeks saw the economic consequences that could result from trading settlements and then colonies, everybody wanted to jump on board. Some of the more famous places, indeed, in the Mediterranean world were Greek colonies, places that we might not actually think were Greek foundations, like Syracuse in Sicily. That was an ancient place, founded by Corinth, a Greek colony, in 733. Byzantium, the future city of Constantinople, and then Istanbul was founded by the city-state, the metropolis of Megara, which was a city on Attica's western border, right around there. Colonies continued to be founded even as late as the classical period. There were so many of them, hundreds indeed, that Plato referred to the Greeks around the shores of the Mediterranean as frogs around a pond. A lovely image. If you ever go to a pond at evening time, all you hear is that wonderful chorus of frogs making those noises, all gathered around them. Well, for Plato, that was what the Mediterranean looked like, with Greeks being the frogs and the Mediterranean being the pond. There were so many colonies, so many Greek settlements. In South Italy, for example, there were so many Greek settlements that the Greeks of the later period, when the Romans had come onto the scene, referred to it as Magna Graecia, Big Greece. That's similar to how we might talk about Chinatown nowadays, or a Greek town, or something like that in one of our cities. Well, aside from the colonization and increased trade, there are also artistic, social, and cultural innovations that mark this period as a renaissance. For example, the Greek alphabet, which was introduced and kind of adapted from the Phoenicians, a Semitic people off to the Near East, now comes into the Greek world. And of course, with that, the writing down of the first text in Greek, Homer's Iliad, which took place somewhere around 700 BC. The first Olympic Games were held at Olympia, traditionally in 776 BC. These were games in honor of Zeus of Olympia, and they were pan-Hellenic. In other words, all Greek, in the sense of drawing competitors and spectators from all over Greece, and only from Greece. You could not be a barbarian, as the Greeks would say, a varvaros, and take part in the Olympic Games. In time, other pan-Hellenic or all Greek athletic competitions were held. There was one at Delphi in honor of Apollo, at Isthmia, which was near Corinth on the Isthmus, in honor of the god Poseidon, and at another place called Nemea in the Argolid region of the Peloponnesus in honor of Zeus. And these 4 sets of games, Olympia, Delphi, Isthmia, and Nemea, together formed what was known as the Olympic cycle. Okay, so the Olympics were held at Olympia, then the next year there would be another one at Delphi, then the next year at Isthmia, and then Nemea, and then back to Olympia again. So every 4 years, the Olympics would be held. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? We have these competitions being held every year in a different place. And that's why the modern Olympics are held every 4 years, because they're modeled on the ancient Olympics at Olympia that, of course, were held every 4 years. But time was told by that. So the Greeks would say, oh, such and such an event happened in the 50th Olympiad, which would mean, so many years after the first Olympics in 776. Cult centers began to spring up all over the place as well during the 8th century Renaissance, including, as I say, the Oracle of Delphi, which you see in front of you here, and also of Zeus at Dodona. This is all that's left of it there, unfortunately. And these different oracles, these places where where the Greeks could ask the gods for advice on, or instruction on what to do in given situations, spoken through their priests or priestesses, attracted Greeks and non-Greeks too, for that matter, from all over the world to visit them. There were more advances in pottery designs, also the late geometric pottery, as I talked about. We now start to see the introduction of group scenes and mythological scenes on pots. So this is a real artistic advancement too. We also have the appearance of the first large or monumental temples, and monumental in the sense that the ones before them were very small. It wasn't, however, until the middle of the 7th century BC that we start to find marble and limestone being used in temple construction. Literature also flourished, especially epic poetry. And I've mentioned Homer now several times. I'll just go a little bit into some more detail here with him now. Homer's poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, about the fall of Troy to the Greeks and the wanderings of the Greek hero Odysseus back to his home, were sung by bards known as rhapsodes since the 12th century BC as part of an oral tradition. Okay, and they were intoned. They would have been recited not just like how I'm talking right now. In fact, in a moment, I'm actually going to give you a sample of what they would have sounded like. And there was no single version of these stories. Oral poets would have memorized these tales and kind of recomposed them on the spot. And for all of these centuries, these various different oral poets would have gone around Greece, and we know, because of comparative data with other oral traditions of poetry, basically how this was done. There would have been what were known as formulae or stock phrases, mnemonic devices, and things like that, that are, if you've ever read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you know that they're filled with that wherever a character is named, he's always got an epithet, a little phrase that accompanies his name. And scholars have learned in the 20th century that those phrases, those epithets, those formulae, all are meant to fit the particular rhythm of the poems. Because, see, the poems were written, both of them, the Iliad and the Odyssey, in a very, very strict meter known as dactylic hexameter. And the word dactylos in Greek means a finger. And that is because if you took your index finger and straightened it out, you would see one long and two short segments. Okay, go ahead and do it right now. You'll see one long and two short segments. And so that meant that, and then hexameter, of course, means 6 of those. So you would have 6 feet, as it's known, 6 different units of one long syllable followed by 2 short. Ancient Greek has these long and short syllables, where a long syllable is basically like a half note, and a short syllable is basically like a quarter note. So you wind up with a rhythm of a line, 6 of those, like that. Okay, and every one of the lines of Homer is written like that. You can substitute one long syllable for 2 short, so that varies the meter a little bit. And in addition, the ancient Greek language initially had a tonal system, kind of like Chinese, where a grave, I'm sorry, an acute accent, an accent that goes from the bottom left to the upper right, meant that you raise the pitch slightly. Not that you stress it like they do in modern Greek, but you raise the pitch. So the word, for instance, in ancient Greek is logos, logos, like that. It has an acute over the initial omicron. There is also a grave accent that is going from the upper left to the lower right. And that would mean you don't raise the pitch. You just don't do anything. Then there is also an accent, a circumflex, which is a combination of the acute and the grave, and where you raise and lower the pitch so that you get kind of a sound like, well, a raising and a lowering. That, for instance, the ancient Greek word for slave is the word doulos, like that. It has a circumflex over the initial diphthong. So you combine the very beautiful tonal system with the dactylic hexameter rhythm, and you get literally one of the most rich and amazing, and of course combine it all together with a great story too, the meaning of the words, and you have one of the most amazing poetic aesthetic experiences really that can be imagined. It's worth learning ancient Greek just so you can read Homer in the original. Just to give you a little sample of what that feels like, I'm going to give you the opening, what is this, 10 lines or so of the Odyssey, okay? Just to give you a kind of sample as to what the musical pitch accent plus the quantitative rhythm of the hexameter sounds like combined. I'll just translate for you very quickly what this says. This is the opening invocation to the muse, where Homer speaks and says, "Sing to me, O muse, of the man of many turns, who wandered far and wide after sacking the sacred citadel of Troy. He saw the towns of many men and learned their mind. He suffered much pain in his heart upon the deep, striving to save his own life and that of his comrades. But he was not able to save his comrades, although he tried, for they perished by their own mad recklessness, the fools who devoured the sacred cattle of the god Helios. And he took away from them the day of their returning. Of these things now, O goddess, daughter of Zeus, sing even to us." Okay, so that's what you're about to hear right now. And this is what it sounds like. Pay attention to the dactylic hexameter, the rhythm, the quantitative rhythm, not the stress, and then the musical pitch accents. Andromayen pemusa, polutrabon hosmala polla, blankte petroiasiaron, ptolietron perse, polon dantropon, idenastea kai nohonegno, polla dogen pantoe patnalge hon katatymon, arnumenos hantepsykan kai noston etaeron, alud hos etarus erysatohi emenosper, authongars peteraisin atastaliaisin olonto, nepioi hoi katabu superionos aelioio, estion autaratoisin apeleton ostiman emar, tonamaten getea, tugaterdios epekai hemin. It is easy, therefore, to understand why the 8th century is called a Renaissance, as we pass into what is known as the Archaic Period of ancient Greek history, that lasts from, as I say, middle of the 8th century, 750 or so BC, to 478 BC. Yet, if the Archaic Period is the time of innovation and when history comes alive, so to speak, why is it called archaic? That was the question that I mentioned so long ago, and hopefully you've been very patient with it. Now I'm going to answer it. Archaic is a word that we use today to mean old-fashioned and even obsolete, right? A manual typewriter, a gramophone record player, something like that are all archaic. So the answer to why we call this period archaic is because, like many of the words today, it has changed its meaning over time, and we no longer use it in its literal sense. We've probably forgotten that literally archaic comes from the Greek word arche, which means the beginning. That is the starting point of something new. And hence we use the term to describe pre-classical Greece because the Archaic period is a new one after the murkiness of the Dark Ages. It is a new historical period. As well as all these great advances, the Archaic period is unfortunately marred by increasing warfare between individual states and civil distress among the people that culminates in civil war. It's this background that shapes the major political and judicial advances, though. And that is what I need to turn to now. So far, we've been able to talk about changes that affect the Greek world as a whole, such as trade, colonies, introduction of the Greek alphabet as we know it, and so on. But now I want to focus on the mainland of Greece, because this is where our three themes, remember, democracy, law, and imperialism, all come about. This is where they happen. This is where the action is. Here on the mainland of Greece, we can also see that significant changes have taken place during the Bronze Age. As we talked about before, the Greeks lived in these small areas, each controlled by a palace center headed by a king. And that king was independent of the other rulers, and so were the communities. So each palace center then was autonomous, and the kings were likewise independent. There was no super king that was in charge of them all. And if you read the Iliad, you'll know that this is basically the situation, right? Agamemnon is just a king. He sort of looked at as being in charge of the whole expedition, but he is just a king. And Odysseus is the king of Ithaca, and Nestor is the king of Pylos, and Achilles is the king of Scheria, and so on. I'm sorry, not Scheria, Phthia. But you understand what I'm talking about. Well, during the Dark Ages, the monarchy, as we saw before, disappeared. Sometime in the 12th century, the monarchies were overthrown, and power fell into the hands of a number of aristocratic families that were given the collective name in our sources as eupatridae. Okay, eupatridae. This literally means well-born, or even more literally, those who come from a noble family, even more literally, those who come from a good father, right? Because pater means father, and that prefix eu means something good, in this case, noble. So those were born from a noble father. In some cities, such as Athens, a number of families were in power, and they married only within themselves so as to preserve that power, to preserve exclusivity. You couldn't break into that closed shop. We don't know exactly who these families were at this early time. We do have the names of some families, such as the Alcmeonidae, who are a very powerful blue-blooded family from Athens. Pericles will be a member of this family. But we don't know the name of all the families. That's why we tend to use this collective term, the eupatridae, to refer to all of those ruling families. We also don't know how they came to dominate political life. Perhaps they formed the king's advisory council. There was this body known as the boule, which simply means the will, or in fact, in modern day Greece, the name for the parliament is the vouli, which is just the modern pronunciation of the boule. Whatever the case may be, they certainly they usurped power for themselves at the end of the Bronze Age with the collapse of the monarchies. But what we can say is that throughout the Dark Ages and into the Archaic period, Greece was controlled by this number of aristocratic families who thus exercised oligarchical power. And we can say Greece then was an oligarchy, a form of government in which a few powerful members or families rule and control all the power. Gradually, some of these communities in various parts of Greece amalgamated into larger ones. And when this amalgamation took place, one town in particular in an area became the main one for that area. This main town would have a high citadel, the Greek word for which is an acropolis. Akros means high up, and polis means city, so the high point of the city. And this was usually the chief market for the area. So, for example, Athens became the chief city in Attica, the peninsula, because of its high fortified acropolis and its market called the Agora. You remember that the Bronze Age civilizations had built their fortified palaces on top of hillsides, and the importance of a fortified citadel continued into the Archaic period. This chief town, this chief part of the area, became known as the polis, okay, the city. Its plural is polis, not polises, just so you know. And the people who lived in this area also became its citizens. So in other words, if we're using Athens as our model, when Athens became the polis of Attica, Attica The peninsula is an area of about 900 square miles. Those who lived in the city of Athens were Athenians, and those who lived all over Attica were also Athenians. Okay, so you've got Athens, the polis, and Athens, the area around it. It's a little bit of an ambiguous term, therefore. As I said, we can see the origins of the polis system in the autonomous palace centers of the Bronze Age period, because each polis was also autonomous. And polis is a hard word to grapple with. It really is. It's usually translated as city-state, but even that is an awkward term. It is actually more like a state than it is a city. In other words, it really was a geographical area. So it's something akin maybe to Vatican City. The fact that it's a city-state tells us something immediately about the nature of the Greek polis. Each one was its own territory and governed itself, as well as the area in which it was located. Each had its own citizenship, and later on, each had its own laws and coinage. It was entirely self-sufficient, and it was actually fiercely independent. Today, of course, we know Greece as one country with the capital in Athens, and places like Thebes, Delphi, Olympia having their own city councils, but ultimately bound to the federal government of Athens. Well, it was not like that in antiquity. Each of these places was the polis of its own area. So traveling from, say, Athens to Corinth or from Athens to Delphi was like traveling from, France to Germany today, leaving aside, of course, the linguistic difference. The bulk of the Greeks lived in a polis system, as I've been describing, and this is where a number of towns had one particular town that was the chief one, the polis. The other towns in the area were just towns. But there were some Greeks who actually did not live in a polis system. They didn't have a central polis. And this type of community was called an ethnos. It gives us our word ethnic. Many states in the Peloponnesus, for instance, and some in central Greece, like Aetolia and Phocis, were ethne. It's the plural of ethnos, ethne. Those who lived in polis, those are the city-states, thought that the Greeks who chose to live in ethne were inferior. They thought this because they considered the polis the best form of community. They couldn't understand why anyone didn't want to live in the polis system proper. So there's perhaps a degree of snobbery there. Of course, when Aristotle, the great 4th century philosopher, would define what a human being is, he would say, "Ho anthropos estin politikons doon." A human being is an animal that lives in a polis, a creature that lives in a polis. So for Aristotle, in whom so much of what was implicit before in Hellenism becomes explicit, humanity takes its essential definition from the fact that it lives in a polis. That tells you something about how they viewed things. But whatever the case may be on that, most Greeks did live in a polis. Some chose not to, though. As for monarchy, the Greeks as a whole looked down their noses at states that still had monarchy. The only one that was really nearby at all was Macedonia in northern Greece, which was a monarchy. The Greeks thought that the people who lived under a king were either too stupid to govern themselves or just, naturally given to being enslaved. They looked at peoples of the East, such as Persia, as being definitely inferior in the sense that they lived under a king who basically was their master. A lot of these prejudices would evolve more as time went on, particularly when Greece would come into warfare with the Persians. Needless to say, this is a factor that has come into how the later Macedonian kings, in particularly, dealt with the Greeks. And we won't get into that until much later in our course, but I'll just point it out to you now that the Greeks basically looked down at those Macedonians in the north as being somehow culturally inferior. However, the polis system did have its flaws, and serious flaws, as we'll see in a moment. And so those who were living in that system ought not to have been casting stones. The reason why the polis system developed as it did are not properly known. Most common explanations include some kind of ethnic differences, or the different characteristics of the Greeks, and even geographical features like rivers and mountain ranges, because these made travel difficult. So remember, there were no roads in those days. There were no tunnels through mountains. So if you wanted to go from Polis A to Polis B, you had to go hike up those steep mountains that we saw in the movie. And that means that a polis on one side of a hill or a mountain could grow up completely independently of a polis on the other side of the mountain. and the two population groups might never even get to know each other. Believe it or not, this was still very much the case, really, right on up until the 20th century in Greece, where people who, tended to live really within about 15, 20 miles of where they were born. Most people in human history were like that until the modern age. The system might not sound great on the one hand, this emphasis on self-sufficiency does sound nice. This emphasis on autonomy that is at the heart of the polis system, that does sound appealing. But even this independence, these characteristics, led to feelings of xenophobia developing among the Greeks for each other. And as I said before, we might expect the Greeks to have, looked at one another as being just fellow Greeks, but to a large degree, they looked at their fellow Greeks and other polis with fear or dislike, in a way that surprises us. You say, okay, I can understand they looked at the Persians, who were linguistically, ethnically, racially different than them. They looked at them with such negativity, but how can we can explain this, that they looked at those of the same, the same ethnic family, basically, as being so different? Well, as time wore on, we'll see that polis would oftentimes wage war with one another. And these wars ranged from skirmishes over territorial disputes, for example, to states actually taking part in massive civil wars that would rip Greece apart, like the Peloponnesian War of 431 to 404 BC. And it's the polis system that explains why the Greeks were only able to unite a couple of times. The first during the Olympic truce, as it was called, and the second time when faced by a common foe like the Persians early in the 5th century. It also explains why a king like the Macedonian Philip II in the late 4th century could so easily defeat the Greeks by playing on their disunity, right? Divide and conquer. The Eupatridae, those aristocratic rulers, were not very good rulers. And a huge gap soon arose between the aristocrats and the non-nobles. Social and economic distress was rampant throughout Greece. Many people started to starve. Not everybody could take part in a colonizing venture or even wanted to. And what we have, therefore, is the Eupatridae starting to focus only on themselves and on faction fighting amongst themselves and ignoring the plight of the poor, the non-nobles. During the Dark Ages and even after the Dark Ages, there were a series of natural disasters, bad harvests, probably a rise in birth rate. And as a result, the land would just not support the ordinary farmers. And so they took out loans from their rich aristocratic overlords. And these people who took out loans became known as the hektemoroi, wonderful ancient Greek word, from the Greek word hektemorion, which means 1/6, meaning that they probably had to pay back what they borrowed together with 1/6 of what it was in the form of interest. If they defaulted on this repayment, then their lands would be seized, and this happened throughout Attica. Then, to make matters even worse, they would be sold as slaves by the aristocrats to try to recoup their losses. So this is not only a terrible situation morally, but it's also a breeding ground for civil war. Imagine being sold into slavery by your peers, your fellows. Okay, I called them their overlords, but really all they are just, their neighbors. Well, with all of that seen in mind, we move then to the scenario where we start to see social and economic distress leading to the overthrow of existing regimes, the onslaught of civil war. And that is where we're going to be picking up next time in our next lecture, with some states outside Athens who experienced this civil war that led to new regimes. Thank you.